December 1942, Buna, on the northern coast of Papua New Guinea. Lieutenant General Robert L. Eichelberger has just been sent in by Douglas MacArthur to break a stalled American offensive against a small, dug-in Japanese garrison. The fighting is savage, but that is not what worries Eichelberger most. His men are collapsing in the jungle heat, shaking with fever, unable to stand, and it has nothing to do with Japanese bullets. He will later write plainly that disease was a surer and more deadly peril to his troops than enemy marksmanship. The U.S. Army Medical Department will later estimate that at Buna, disease casualties outnumbered combat casualties not marginally, but by a factor of 7 to 10. A few months later, General MacArthur put a number on the problem in a single sentence that should be far more famous than it is. He said, "This would be a long war if for every division actually facing the enemy, he had to count on a second division in the hospital with malaria, and a third still convalescing from it. And the enemy responsible for 2 of every 3 men was not the Imperial Japanese Army. It was a mosquito, roughly the size of a grain of rice." This is a story about that mosquito, and about the strange, ironic answer the United States found for it. Because the drug that eventually let American soldiers stand back up in the Pacific was not American. It was German. It had been invented by chemists working for one of the largest industrial companies in the Third Reich, and for most of the 1930s, an American pharmaceutical firm had been contractually bound to that same German company by a peacetime business deal. The company that held its formula came fully under American control only a few months before Pearl Harbor. To understand how strange that is, you have to go back to where quinine came from in the first place. For roughly 300 years, the only widely available and proven antimalarial was quinine, extracted from the bark of the cinchona tree. By the 20th century, the Dutch had turned quinine into a near monopoly, growing the overwhelming majority of the world's supply on plantations in Java, in the Dutch East Indies. When Imperial Japan swept through Southeast Asia in early 1942, it seized those plantations along with everything else, cutting the Allies off from roughly 90% of the world's quinine supply. At the exact moment, American and Australian troops were being sent into some of the most malaria-infested jungles on the planet. The Allies were not starting from zero. A synthetic substitute already existed. It had been synthesized in Germany in 1930 and 1931 by chemists at Bayer, working under the German pharmacologist Wilhelm Rohl, and later refined by Hans Maus and Fritz Mietsch. Bayer called it Atabrine. It reached the United States under the trade name Atabrine, and Americans would come to know it as a small, bitter, unmistakably yellow pill. Here is the part that rarely makes it into the popular history. The American company that would eventually mass-produce Atabrine, the Winthrop Chemical Company, was not some unrelated firm that simply bought a German formula off the shelf when the war started. Winthrop was a subsidiary of Sterling Products, and in 1923, Sterling had signed a cartel agreement with Bayer that handed over fully half of Winthrop's ownership to the German company, in exchange for access to Bayer's patents and manufacturing know-how. For nearly 2 decades, the pipeline of German pharmaceutical chemistry into the United States ran straight through a company that Germany itself partly owned. Atabrine came to America through exactly that pipeline. Then, 3 months before Pearl Harbor, the United States government moved. Under the Trading with the Enemy Act, the alien property custodian severed the ownership ties between Winthrop and its German patron, seizing the German-held stock as enemy property. After the United States entered the war, the newly formed War Production Board gave Atabrine production the highest priority, scaling up manufacture of a drug whose parent company had been partly answerable to Berlin only months earlier. What followed was one of the more remarkable industrial mobilizations of the war, and almost nobody talks about it. In 1943, American manufacturers delivered roughly 1.8 billion doses of Atabrine. In 1944, that number rose to roughly 2.5 billion, a drug invented by German chemists in the years before the Reich, owned in part by a German company until months before the U.S. entered the war, became one of the largest pharmaceutical production efforts in American history, built specifically to keep soldiers fighting Japan on their feet. They needed every dose. On Guadalcanal, by the time the Honest Marine Division was pulled off the island in December 1942, an estimated 8,000 of its men had contracted malaria, and tropical disease had made close to two-thirds of the entire division combat ineffective. Army medical records for Guadalcanal in January 1943 show a malaria admission rate of roughly 1,000 cases per 1,000 men, meaning the average soldier there was not just getting infected once, some were coming down with it 2, 3, 4 times over. One officer, according to accounts from the campaign, dismissed the whole problem early on, reportedly saying troops were there to kill Japanese, and to hell with mosquitoes. That attitude did not survive the campaign. Some later analyses put the overall ratio at roughly 5 cases of malaria for every 1 combat casualty in the Solomons. In parts of the Pacific theater as a whole, some historical estimates suggest barely 1 in 8 hospital admissions among American troops was for a battle wound. The rest were disease. Even when the drug was available, getting soldiers to actually take it was its own battle. Atabrine tasted bitter, it upset stomachs, it gave men headaches, and with sustained use, it visibly turned skin a sallow yellow. Rumors spread, amplified by Japanese propaganda, that it caused sterility. It did not, but the fear was enough that men would palm the pill and spit it out the moment the corpsman looked away. The Army's answer was blunt enforcement, what the medical corps itself called Atabrine discipline. Medics were posted at chow lines. A Women's Army Corps member or corpsman would hand a man his tablet and make him open his mouth to prove he had swallowed it before he could move down the line. The Armed Forces Radio Service ran a recurring program on its Pacific Mosquito network called the Atabrine Cocktail Hour, using humor to browbeat men into compliance. The War Department even brought in a young Army captain named Theodore Geisel, who would later become world famous as Dr. Seuss, along with author Munro Leaf, to create a character called Anne, short for Anopheles, the genus of mosquito that carries malaria. The poster showed her as a sultry, blood-drinking femme fatale, with the tagline, "This is Anne, she drinks blood," warning soldiers that she could knock them flat and leave them no good to their country, their outfit, or themselves. The United States government fought a mosquito with a Dr. Seuss cartoon, and it was not a joke, it was policy. But discipline alone does not work if you do not know the correct dose, and early in the war, nobody did. Overdosing caused jaundice, and, in rare cases, psychosis. Underdosing meant the drug did nothing at all. The man who solved that problem was an Australian, Brigadier Neil Hamilton Fairley. By June 1943, an estimated 25,000 Australian troops in Papua and New Guinea had already contracted malaria, and there were not enough healthy men left in the country to sustain the force in the field. Fairley persuaded Australian Command to establish the Land Headquarters Medical Research Unit at Cairns in North Queensland. There, using 868 healthy volunteer soldiers and 317 men already infected, and flying in Anopheles mosquitoes from New Guinea every week to keep the experiments running, his team tested dose after dose until they confirmed the number that mattered. A daily 100 milligram tablet of Atebrin would reliably suppress the disease. That single confirmed number, worked out on volunteers in a research unit most people have never heard of, became the standard the entire Allied war effort in the Pacific was built on. By the final years of the war, the arithmetic had shifted. As Japan's own supply lines collapsed, and its army was pushed back onto islands it could no longer resupply, malaria and dysentery began doing to Japanese units what they had once done to the Americans. In some isolated late-war island garrisons, disease incapacitated the great majority of surviving troops, not American shells. The mosquito had not picked a side, it simply attacked whichever army failed to manage it, and by the closing years of the war that army was, Increasingly, Japan's. Go back to MacArthur's sentence. A second division in the hospital, a third convalescing. He was not speaking in metaphor. He was doing logistics math on a threat that had no rifle, wore no uniform, and could not be captured or interrogated. And one of the medicines that helped bring that math back under control was a pill first synthesized by a German company, freed from German ownership by a wartime legal maneuver, months before Pearl Harbor, force-fed to millions of reluctant soldiers by corpsmen checking open mouths in chow lines, and dosed correctly only because of quiet experiments on volunteers in a research unit in a small city in Queensland that most people will never visit. It worked alongside drainage crews, DDT spraying, mosquito nets, and hard-won discipline, and no one of those fixes beat the mosquito on its own. Nobody puts a mosquito on a war memorial. Nobody names a mosquito in a list of the weapons that won the Pacific. But the corpsmen who stood at those chow lines making tired, frightened, sick young men swallow a bitter yellow pill were fighting on the same front as anyone carrying a rifle, and the ones who never picked up a weapon deserve to be remembered for it too. If someone in your family served in the Pacific and came home talking about the yellow pills, I would genuinely like to hear about it in the comments. Their unit, their island, their story, those details are the actual record, and they are worth keeping. If you want the next one of these, stick around.